I ordered the DNA kit because my daughter asked me to. She was 11 years old and had been assigned a family heritage project at school, the kind where children make poster boards about where their families came from and bring in foods from their culture and present to the class with the particular mix of pride and self-consciousness that 11-year-olds bring to everything. She wanted to know more than I could tell her. I had always known only the broad strokes of my own heritage, the vague European mix my parents had described without much specificity, and Lily deserved better than vague for her poster board. So I ordered the kit on a Tuesday evening, swabbed my cheek, mailed it back, and forgot about it for 3 weeks while life continued in its ordinary way. When the results arrived in my email inbox, I opened them at the kitchen table after dinner, casually, the way you open something you have no reason to approach with caution. I looked at the ethnicity breakdown first because that was what Lily needed for her project. And then I looked at the DNA matches, the relatives the test had found, organized by closeness of relationship. My mother had taken the same test 2 years earlier, a birthday gift from my brother, so I knew her results were in the system. Her name was not there. Not as a close match, not as a distant one. Not anywhere. I checked the settings, thinking I had misread something. I checked again. I sat at my kitchen table in the quiet of my own house and I understood, in the particular way that understanding arrives when you have no framework for it, that something was wrong with what I was looking at in a way I did not yet have words for. Let me take you back to the beginning, because 34 years is a long time to not know something about yourself, and you need to understand the life I had before that Tuesday evening in order to understand what it cost me to have it rewritten. My name is Anna Larson, and I grew up in a house on Birchwood Drive in a town called Clearwater, the only child of Richard and Helen Larson, who were the kind of parents that people mean when they say someone had a good childhood. My father was an engineer, methodical and warm, the kind of man who fixed things around the house not because he had to but because he took quiet satisfaction in things working the way they were supposed to. My mother taught second grade for 27 years and brought the same patients home that she brought to her classroom, which I did not fully appreciate until I was grown and understood how much effort patience actually requires. They were not a dramatic family. They did not fight loudly or love loudly or express things in large gestures. What they did was show up, consistently and without exception, in the small ways that add up to something you can build a life on. I knew I was loved the way you know certain things that are simply true, not because anyone has made a case for them but because the evidence is everywhere you look. I had never had reason to question where I came from. There were photographs of my mother pregnant, which I had seen many times in the family albums that lived on the bottom shelf of the living room bookcase. There was the story of my birth, which my mother told in the particular warm funny way that mothers tell birth stories, the drive to the hospital, the long wait, the moment she first held me, specific enough in its details to have never seemed like anything but memory. There was the physical resemblance that people had commented on my whole life. You have your mother's eyes, her sister used to say, every time she visited. And I had believed it because I could see it when I looked in the mirror and then at my mother, the same particular shape of eye, the same way they crinkled at the corners when she smiled. I had never questioned any of it. I had no reason to. The morning after the DNA results I called my mother. Not immediately, I waited until Lily was at school and my husband, Tom, was at work, because I needed to make the call without managing anyone else's reaction at the same time. I told my mother I had gotten the DNA results and that she didn't appear in them, and I said it as neutrally as I could because there were so many possible explanations and I was not willing to land on the most dramatic one before I had heard what she had to say. There was a silence on the other end of the phone that lasted about 4 seconds. 4 seconds is not a long time. It was long enough. Anna, she said. And then she said nothing else for a moment. And in that moment I understood that whatever she said next was going to be the true version of something I had never been told, and that the true version was going to change things. She said, "Can you come here? I don't want to do this on the phone." I drove to my parents' house that afternoon. My father was at a doctor's appointment that my mother had not rescheduled, which told me she had made a decision before I arrived about how she wanted to handle what was coming. She was in the kitchen when I got there, making tea she didn't drink, the way people do something with their hands when they need the occupation. I sat at the kitchen table where I had sat 1,000 times and I waited, and she set the tea down and sat across from me and looked at me the way she had always looked at me, with the specific attention of someone who knows you completely, and she said, "You were adopted. We adopted you when you were 3 days old. And I am so sorry that you are finding out this way." The world did not stop. That is the first thing I want to tell you, because the movies make it seem like a revelation this size should stop everything, should produce a physical response that matches its emotional scale. What happened was quieter and stranger than that. I sat across from my mother at the kitchen table and I looked at her face, the face I had known my entire life, and I thought about the photographs in the album and the birth story and the eyes that crinkled the same way, and then I thought about the DNA results and the 4 seconds of silence on the phone, and I felt something I can only describe as the particular vertigo of the floor shifting without moving, everything still in its place and nothing in the same position. My mother talked for a long time. She had been waiting to have this conversation for 34 years, and the waiting had built up a pressure that came out now in careful, organized sentences that told me she had rehearsed this, not recently but over decades, saying different versions of it to herself in the privacy of her own mind. She and my father had been unable to conceive after 2 years of trying and medical interventions that had been, she said with a brevity that I understood covered a great deal of pain, unsuccessful. They had pursued adoption through a private agency, and I had been placed with them when I was 3 days old, the daughter of a young woman named Margot who was 19 years old and single and who had made the decision, with what the agency had described as great deliberateness and love, to place her baby with a family who could give her things she could not. My mother said Margot's name carefully, the way you say the name of someone you have thought about for 34 years without ever meeting, with a respect that was specific and genuine. They had intended to tell me. That was the thing she returned to most, the thing I could hear her needing me to believe, that they had always intended to tell me, that it had been their plan from the beginning to sit me down at some age they kept pushing forward and explain the truth in a way I would be able to understand. But the right age kept moving. At 5 it seemed too young. At 8 I was going through a difficult year at school and the timing felt wrong. At 12 she had sat on the edge of my bed 3 times preparing to begin the conversation and found, each time, that she could not locate the version of the words that would not hurt me. At 16 she had started and I had been in the middle of a crisis with a friend and she had stopped and told herself she would wait until things were calmer. At 25 I had been planning my wedding and she had not wanted to disrupt what should have been a purely joyful time. At 30 I had been pregnant with Lily and the same reasoning had applied. Year after year the conversation had been postponed by a love that was afraid of its own consequences, and then a decade had passed and then 2 and then I had taken a DNA test for a school project and the conversation had been made for them. My father came home while she was still talking. He walked into the kitchen and saw us both and understood from our faces what had happened, and he sat down at the table beside my mother and he said my name once, quietly, and then he waited. I looked at my father, this man who had fixed things around the house not because he had to but because he liked things working the way they were supposed to, and I thought about 34 years of showing up, the school events and the bad years and the good years and the ordinary Tuesday evenings that are the actual substance of a life, and I thought about the word adopted, which I had just learned applied to me, and I tried to find inside myself some alteration in what that word meant. When applied to the man sitting across from me, I could not find one. He was my father. That had not changed. That, I realized sitting there, was not actually in question. What was in question was everything else, my history, my biology, the woman named Margot who was now in her early 50s and who had made a decision when she was 19 that had determined the entire shape of my life. I had questions that my parents could not fully answer because the agency records were sealed and what they knew was limited to what had been shared with them at the time. That Margot was young, that she was healthy, that she had made her decision carefully and with love. That was what they had been told. That was what they had held on to for 34 years as the thing they could give me when the time finally came. I stayed at my parents' house until 9 o'clock that evening. We talked and then we sat quietly and then we talked again, and at some point my mother made the tea she had forgotten earlier and we drank it and the kitchen looked the same as it always had and was completely different at the same time. I hugged them both when I left, the kind of hug you give when you need to hold on to something while you work out what you are feeling, and I drove home in a silence that was very full. I told Tom that night, after Lily was asleep. He listened the way he always listens, completely and without interrupting, and when I finished he said, "What do you want to do?" which is the exact right question and the reason I married him. I told him I didn't know yet. He said I had time. I said I knew, and also I wasn't sure I did, because I was 34 years old and there was a woman somewhere in the world who was the biological reason I existed, and I had just found out about her and time suddenly felt less abundant than it had the day before. I started the search for Margot 6 weeks later, after I had spent those 6 weeks sitting with what I knew and deciding, carefully, that I wanted to know more. The search was not simple. The adoption had been private and the records were sealed, but it was also not impossible, because the same DNA technology that had started all of this could also help finish it. I hired a genealogist who specialized in adoption searches, a woman named Christine who approached the work with the methodical warmth of someone who had done this many times and understood that she was handling something fragile. It took 4 months. In the end it was a combination of the DNA database, Christine's research, and a distant biological cousin who had also taken the test and was willing to share what she knew. Margot's full name was Margot Ellis. She was 53 years old. She lived in a city called Hartfield, 3 hours from where I had grown up. She was a nurse. She had been married for 22 years to a man named Philip, and they had 2 children, a son who was 28 and a daughter who was 25. She had built a life, a full and ordinary one, and somewhere inside it she had been carrying, for 34 years, the fact of me. Christine made the first contact, which is the standard approach, a letter to Margot explaining that an adoptee was searching, asking if she was open to contact, providing enough information to make clear who was asking without creating pressure to respond. The letter went out on a Thursday. We heard back on a Monday, which was faster than Christine had prepared me for. Margot's response was 4 sentences. She said she had thought about this day for 34 years. She said she would like to speak. She said she was nervous and she hoped I was well. She said that if I was willing, she would like to hear about my life. We spoke for the first time on a Wednesday evening in November, and I sat in my car in the driveway because I had not trusted myself to have the conversation inside the house with Lily potentially within earshot. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was lower than I had imagined and warmer, and she said my name, Anna, in a way that made me understand she had said it before, privately, in the 34 years when I was a person she had given away and had not stopped thinking about. I said her name back. We were both quiet for a moment, the particular silence of 2 people who have arrived somewhere they were always going to arrive and are now standing in it. She told me about the decision she had made when she was 19. Not defensively, she did not need to defend it to me and seemed to know that, but carefully, the way you describe something that was the hardest thing you have ever done and that you have made your peace with without ever fully leaving it behind. She had been young and alone and frightened and certain, she said, that the most loving thing she could do was to choose parents who were ready for a child when she was not. She had chosen a closed adoption because she had believed, at 19, that a clean break was the kindest form. She had spent the years since wondering if that had been right. She had hoped, she said, that the family I had gone to had been good. I told her they had been. I told her about my father and the things he fixed around the house and my mother and the patients she brought home from 27 years of second grade. I heard something in Margot's breathing change when I said this, a release, quiet and enormous, the sound of someone setting down something they have been carrying for a very long time. We have spoken 9 times since that first call. We have met in person twice, once in a coffee shop in a city between our 2, where we sat for 4 hours and talked and looked at each other the way people do when they are looking for themselves in a stranger's face, and once at my parents' house, which was Margot's suggestion and which I had needed several weeks to agree to and which turned out to be the most extraordinary afternoon of my life. My mother made lunch. My father talked to Margot about her work and asked questions the way he always asks questions, with the genuine curiosity of someone who is interested in other people's expertise. Margot and I sat beside each other on the couch and I watched her look at my daughter and I watched Lily look back with the open curiosity of a child who has been told only the broad truth, that this is a woman who is part of where I come from, and I thought about the school project that had started all of this and the DNA kit and the Tuesday evening at the kitchen table, and I thought about all the ways the truth had been trying to arrive for 34 years and had finally found its way in through a door none of us had thought to open. I am 35 years old. I have 2 families now, which sounds complicated and is, but is also something I have found, in the year since the DNA results, to be more gift than burden. I have the family that raised me, my father who fixes things and my mother who is patient, and I have the woman who made the decision at 19 that put me in their hands, and I have a half-brother and half-sister in Hartfield who have approached me with a careful warmth that I am returning in kind. I have Lily, who now has a poster board that tells a story much more interesting than anyone else in her class, and Tom, who said what do you want to do and has supported every answer I have given since. My mother and I talked, recently, about the years of postponed conversations, all the right ages that had come and gone while she held the truth and waited for a moment that never felt right enough. I told her I wished she had told me sooner. She said she knew. I told her also that I understood why she hadn't, not as an excuse but as the truth of who she was, a woman who loved her daughter so much that she was afraid of the version of love that included difficult information, and who had let that fear go on too long. She nodded and her eyes did the thing they have always done, the crinkle at the corners, and I looked at it and I thought about the DNA results that showed no biological match and I thought about the fact that we had the same crinkle anyway, that you can inherit things from the people who raise you that have nothing to do with genetics, that love leaves marks as real as any chromosome. I was adopted. The people who adopted me loved me so fiercely they were afraid to tell me the truth, and that fear cost both of us something we cannot get back, and it was also, in its twisted way, the most complete proof of how much I had always been theirs. The woman who gave birth to me made the hardest decision of her life at 19 because she believed I deserved more than she could give. She was right and it cost her 34 years of wondering, and I am going to spend the years we have now making sure she knows it was not wasted. I am someone's daughter twice over. I have decided that is not a complication. It is, in fact, more than most people get. And I am holding it carefully, with both hands, the way you hold something that arrived late and matters completely.